Okay, let's go right into our next section. We started an Inclusion Best Practices Forum this year. So here to launch it, to officially tell everybody about it, is Cydni Tetro is going to bring Julie Simmons, one of our board members from Women Tech Council, and Denise, who is also leading the initiative, on stage, and they are going to launch it.
See, we're following protocol of walking up the stairs. That's right. Thanks, Sarah. And thank you, everyone. Great TED-style talks. Love being inspired by those. And as our conversation continues today, we really wanted to talk a little bit about one of the new programs that we're creating at the Women Tech Council, what we're hoping for the impact, and actually a little bit of call to action for the community in general as we develop this. One of the things you should know about the Women Tech Council is we think about everything under programming. How do we create programs that are sustainable, that create impact, and that leverage the community? And this is one of those new initiatives, which we're calling the Inclusion Best Practices Forum. A little bit of background. When we started the Women Tech Council 10 years ago, this was the first place we went. We said, let's go to all of those companies who have organizations that are creating inclusion, diversity, women's groups, and bring them together and start sharing what's going on. Well, at the time, it didn't really work because there weren't actually any groups that we could really leverage. So a number of years later, what's happened over the last number of years is, as you heard today from many of our first keynotes, they have formal programs now. And we're now at a point where, in order to create stronger impact, we need to learn a bunch from what everyone else is doing. So let us just share with you a little bit of the stats, and then we'll just have a conversation around some of the other motives behind this. So in gender diversity, we just wanted to give you a few stats. I think a couple of things to note is we don't think about gender because it's gender. We only think about it because it's about high-performing teams. We think about the reason to do this because the teams perform better. There are a massive number of studies out now that tell you that teams who have women on them outperform in revenue and profits. And they've tracked those for a long time. So we care passionately about that and the direction of that. And so this is registering very high for companies. How do we get diverse talent on teams and then drive performance for that? Those two stats correlate with that, right? Firms in the top 25% register for gender diversity, register a 15% increase in financial performance. That's meaningful for those organizations. And so we want to be part of creating the impact there. It is still true that women lag in terms of senior leaderships across the country. So we tend to look at what's going on in the country, what's happening in our local economy, and then how do we leverage those. So these are what those numbers look like. What we know is that as women move up the ranks, we get fewer and fewer women as we go into senior roles. And we have significant impact in those senior roles. In Utah, it is a very big initiative for us to figure out how to drive more women in. We would really prefer to not be ranked near the bottom. We really want to figure out how to increase our community and drive this environment that's better for everyone. We have seen some increases over the last few years, but we have a bunch of work to do, which is really what we're about, is just continuing to move the ball forward and make a difference from where we're at today. So we decided to form this committee, and we went to all of our really great partners who have these really, have a number of them that represent a number of our organizations, and asked them to come together and ask them to be our steering committee to help us solve these issues and use best practices and bring them forward. So this is our team of people that are heading this up, and Denise is chairing this effort with Julie for us. And these are really our objectives. This was really to create a group of people who could go after creating a change for us, taking best practices from groups who have created women's organizations, whatever they call them, diversity, inclusion, women in action, all of those names, learn what they're doing, learn what's working, learn how they're measuring their impact, and make those available to other organizations so that together we're creating better environments. That's what we're after. We did a couple of really cool things. We partnered with the University of Utah and the business school. Lyda Bigelow is also here. And they agreed to help us publish those case studies so that we can take active case studies from organizations and move that forward. And those are really cool things for us to be able to showcase what's actually making change. We care about things that are making a difference, and we care about repeatability of those programs. So, Julie, let's talk a little bit about that. What are we going to, tell us a little bit more about what you think we're going to do with the best practices and how we're going to share those.
So first and foremost, this is really to create a mechanism and a resource for people to be able to utilize to really make an impact in diversity. So from a goal-based perspective, one of the first things she mentioned we're going to be doing is partnering with the University of Utah and really establishing some benchmark baselines. So as people are looking at how do we solve this problem, not only from an incoming retention perspective, incoming attraction perspective, but also retention and promotion, on how do we really make a difference at all levels of the organization. So we're going to be providing resources both online, and we'll have some face-to-face meetings. I was wondering about that. Sorry, I thought I had turned on my back. But we're really going to provide resources for the community to be able to use as a whole and really open up the dialogue and share what's working, what's not working, because we know some programs work better than others, but it's all about attracting and retaining talent so we can drive really better results for our businesses and organization.
So Denise, lead on to that a little bit. I mean, obviously we're going to measure some things, and then what do you expect over this next year to develop, and how do we need, help do we need from companies to be able to do this?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. Can you guys hear me? I feel like I'm echoing.
Do a test.
Okay, so we have a couple of things. So one, just to build off of what Julie was saying, and the University of Utah and their gracious support, they have a very simple case study kind of outline. If you're already doing a program and you want it measured, they'll come in and do the heavy lifting for you, and they'll write a case study. They can either do it blind without using your company name if you don't want it used, or if you do. And so we want to do that. We also want to establish some other metrics, and the Women Tech Council did an economic study a few years ago, and I'll come back to that because we want to kind of redo that. And then also we want to do other things like groups in a box. So sample charters, sample agendas, lots of networking opportunities, lists of speakers that could come into your company from the community. So really make a resource on the Women Tech Council site so that it's super turnkey. Everybody can participate, whether you're a small nonprofit, and we know that nonprofits have actually a different type of concern with inclusion and diversity versus maybe a big multinational or global company. Coming back to the Tech Council and what we did on the economic study, and Sid, you might want to add in here, but there was a study done a couple of years ago, and it started to talk about, and this is where a stat, Cydni, you mentioned this morning, around women do come, like they might leave STEM fields, but they don't actually leave the workforce. And so it's a big misnomer that women leave the workforce in droves at certain points in their career. And so we want to continue to update that study, maybe revamp it slightly, and then continue kind of a longitudinal study with the University of Utah so we can show our progress over time.
Yeah, that's a good point. When we created the economic impact survey, we surveyed our population to see, what are they thinking about in terms of jobs, where are they going. Only 13% of the women have ever taken time off in their career. They've stayed working as they've had children and gone through, which in our community is a really big myth. People think that it's half of it, but it's about 13% of women who have left and then returned to the workforce. So it is true, right, that women are staying in the workforce. But one of the things from the economic study, which is also part of what we're thinking about in the inclusion framework or in the best practices forum, is how do we measure and what are those elements that women are evaluating when they look for job changes? And the economic impact study gave us some insights into that, because what it told us is outside of equal pay and benefits, which sometimes we just assume are a given, the thing that they really start looking for is really around what they describe as culture and or flexibility. And by flexibility, they actually don't mean working less hours. That's what other people think flexibility means, but what they really mean is hold me accountable, let me do my job, and then based on my performance, allow me to have those opportunities. But it's okay if I need to go to the choir concert at 4 o'clock or the soccer game or whatever it is, as long as you build a culture of accountability. So when we started to ask our women, when they were evaluating companies, these are the things that they were looking for. So as we talked about, how do you create this forum? We need best practices from those companies that create repeatability so that everyone knows what's going on. And so we're trying to leverage the economic impact study and the framework that provided us with, the best practices from the company, and create these models that really, really make a difference. Now, you two have had an opportunity to kick off some of the very first sessions and start us down this path. What have we learned so far from those companies about what they're doing that's going to be really beneficial to share with the community?
Yeah, a few things. I think Vance hit on it this morning when he said it's not a women's issue. It is a people issue. So if diversity initiatives are thought of as a standalone and not a cultural issue, then we know that that doesn't work, right? So I know that Ancestry, for example, as they've kicked off their Women in Tech program, one of the things they've talked about that's really working is you have to include men. It can't be about women versus men. It has to be an inclusive topic of how we make impact in these areas. And they've also invited a lot of speakers internally and externally. So as they do coaching and they help women with these conversations and men with these conversations, they actually have different perspectives to bring to the conversation. There are companies like Intel, for example, that they actually, to bring it into their culture, they also have inclusive leadership initiatives where certain senior people can apply to be an inclusive facilitator. And then once a month, they conduct sessions and coaching, so it permeates the culture. And again, it's not a one-off. So those are some of the quick, short examples that people are starting to look at.
Yeah, and then Kathy from Domo was sharing with us a bunch of their best practices, starting with, even before kids, so a lot of our kind of girls who code, and so they're really trying to attract even prior to university, and then partnering through university programs. And often companies have university programs where they go after and they form relationships with executives, alumni, but Adobe's doing one better than that. They're really trying to target specific universities that might attract a more diverse and inclusive culture and group of people to their company. And then once they get to the company, there's lots of groups. It's not just a women's group. There's a photography group. There's lots of social clubs. And then, of course, that leads into learning and development, as well as policies, so leave policies, et cetera. And then one quote that I love from her, which is, they really, at Domo, try to meet their people where they are and where they're interested. And so really bringing in that inclusive culture. I say that fast 3 times. But one other thing real quick is that I was doing some reading, and it was talking about inclusion should be the program and diversity should be the outcome metric. Yeah. And so I just really like that separation.
I think that's important. I think that's one of the things we're trying to figure out too, is what are those measurements? Because sometimes they feel like soft programs, but we need to actually understand their impact. That's one of the reasons we decided to go measure it with the University of Utah. So we figured we didn't have enough data just yet that you could publish everything, but if we could publish best practices, that in general it would tell a better story, and we can figure out how that continues us forward, which I think is a really, really great thing for us. Related to this, I wanted to just kind of continue this conversation and talk a little bit about a couple of topics that come up, and ask you guys both a personal question too. As you've grown your careers and into senior leadership positions across many organizations, how have you found your male counterparts to be your advocates, and who has been your advocate as you've gone across those?
So that's a great question. For me personally, as most of my career, I've been probably the solo female in the room, and I've had great mentors and advocates that have really helped me along the way. But yet at the same time, what I found personally is that although I've had help as I've built my career, there were times when it was difficult, right? And I didn't really have role models to help me maneuver through the environment, so to speak. But I had a couple of people that really stood out to me, and one that I was reflecting on recently was I actually was recruited to go back to a company that I had worked for, and at the time, it was a position I was really interested in. It was a global position, but I was pregnant with my second child. And at the time, I remember being very panicked because I thought, oh my gosh, this pregnancy is going to cost me this opportunity potentially, right? And I was very worried about it because if you go back in my career 20 years ago, the conversations weren't happening like we're having today. And so I had a boss who was recruiting me that when I told him, my situation, no questions asked, hands down. They accepted me with open arms, even though it wasn't the most convenient the time I had the baby with some of the events that we had going on at the time. But he accepted me into that, and it wasn't even a question that I couldn't go achieve that position, and I couldn't go drive great results despite the personal circumstance that I had at that time. So for me, that was a personal one. And then one other one I just want to weave in is, I've worked for large enterprise, I've worked for small business. Right now I'm working for a small startup. And in our own small way, our company, we're trying to make an impact with women's development. And I went to my co-founder, or my founder, sorry, and CEO Jay Williams and said, hey, here's what I want to do. We want to start a program. We don't have a lot of money for investment. What do you think about this? And his very first response to me was, it's fantastic, and it's more important than our financial bottom line. And for me, and of course in my head, I said, well, actually, it's not more important than our bottom line, because that, it wasn't true. But the second thought I had was, I was so grateful and thankful that he was so supportive, and it really made a difference for him because he recognized the value of what it could drive for the organization as a whole in a cultural perspective. So those are kind of my, standout people that have really helped and impacted me along the way.
And I was, as the youngest of 6, I was really naive to gender differences. I was just always tortured. But when I was working at Barclays in London, this guy came out of the restroom, the men's restroom, and he was talking about how he had gotten his shoe shined. And I was like, what? And he said, yeah, they have the shoe shine, buff and kind of shoe shine in the restrooms for men. And that was the first time I was like, back that truck up. Like, what? I want my shoes shined in the bathroom. And so that was like my first, wow, maybe men and women are treated differently. And so through that eye-opening experience about my shoe shine, it really then became a lot around unconscious bias and just the study of it, and then having a great boss who I've worked for twice now, and he just really kind of challenges you and empowers you and really discusses with you the differences and making sure that we're creating inclusive cultures.
Yeah, I think that, as I reflect on my career and the opportunities I've had, I think that's one of the most important things is that we find advocates and people who just support the direction and really see your talents and accelerate you forward. After I came out of grad school, I jumped into a big company, and then I decided to jump into a smaller company. And the CEO who was running that company became a really great advocate for me. And I wasn't planning it, right? I kind of stumbled into it. And I think I took the job similarly. I was pregnant with my first child. And I went to Darren when I was going to have my baby. And I said, look, I want to work from home every Friday. And he said, okay. And he never once looked back. And what I loved about that is he gave me every opportunity I wanted, every development path that I wanted. He became an advocate for letting me grow and have those opportunities. And he just held me accountable for my job, right? Which is ultimately what I wanted. But I've reflected often on that, where having this environment where we support each other and we see our talents and we help you navigate those paths is super important. And in our world, where we tend to be the only woman in the room, it requires that we have champions of those male advocates. It's on the other side. When I think about my opportunity to go work in Disney and under Imagineering, it was because of one of my friends who was the CTO at one of the previous companies took me in, right? I didn't ever apply for that job. I never got access to that job, but it was because there were people who saw my potential and said, this is an opportunity for you. And so I feel like it's a little reciprocal. And one of the things that we want to create are these environments where we're identifying what people are great at and we're helping them on their paths to success. And everyone is thinking about, men and women are thinking about, what can we do to help develop those people and give them access to the things that grow their careers, that leverage their talents, and allow them to create the impact that they want in the world? That's what we want. That's what all of us want. We want to create impact, and we want to have great outcomes. And so for me, the best practices forum is about that. What are those things that help us systematically provide that and then drive the performance of our entire community so we get the benefits that we want along the way? So let me ask you a question kind of as we're wrapping this up, which is, how do you become an advocate of someone? How do you advocate for other people and champion them? And what should we all be doing every day with the people we interact with to help them on their career paths?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with when you're in the room is watching. People always talk about the third eye, and really watching and understanding who's talking, who's not talking, who has sat at the tables full, making sure that people are brought into the table. If they're on the phone, if they're from a different culture, how can they, making sure that you're getting their voice in the room. If they're from a culture that maybe doesn't speak up, ask them a question, prep them ahead of time. But really, I think just showing up every day for people in the small ways, they'll add up over time.
Yeah, for me it's similar too. I think listening is a big thing, right? Ask, but then listen to the response. So, if you're looking at the onboarding and what the experience is like for your employees, regardless of the gender or the circumstance, you can really learn a lot about, how you are perceived as an organization and how you do integrate and fit into people's lives. So for, I think, me, listening is really important, and then not being afraid to have the conversation, because I have found that most of the time if you bring up the conversation and why it's a positive for an organization, you'll get the support, so I think listening is really key.
Yeah, and I'll just add my one thought there as you were talking. My recommendation is it's all about feedback. So we all have limitations, things that block us from taking the next step in our career, and sometimes no one ever tells us about them. And I remember when I came out of grad school, I came out of MBA school, and I was running a product management team, and I thought I knew everything, right? And so I was pretty sure that in every meeting, I was going to make sure I said everything that came to mind about every topic. And the VP at the time, he turned to me after one meeting, he called me aside, and he's like, Sid, you have to stop talking. Right? He's like, you have to stop that. And I remember, and at that point in time, I had a choice. I can either think he's wrong, right? And I can say, I don't know what you're talking about, and I'm not going to make a change, or I can be reflective on the feedback, and I can decide to incorporate that. And for me, it became a pivotal moment in the way that I changed my approach in interacting with other people. And I believe it afforded me other opportunities. So when you think about that, for me, feedback is not only the ability to give it, but the ability to take it. Because we need both sides in order to progress. We're not perfect, and we have blind spots. And if we can understand our limitations, then it will accelerate the opportunity forward. And I think for me, that's one of those things you become an advocate if you're willing to have hard conversations with people that are under the intention of helping them become better. So I guess our last call to action as we think about this is, if you are an organization that has a women's group or that is thinking of starting one, we would like you to be included in the Best Practices Forum. Perfect thing to do is to reach out to Denise and Julie, and they will include you in. We've already started. We kicked it off last week. We have a series of formal meetings, and this is going to be pretty formal about creating resources, building that case study repository, and feeding that back into our community. So if you're interested in a case study, let us know. If you have great data, you're doing something that wants to be measured, we have a formal route for that. If you want to participate or we can help you in some way, we would love to include you. We won't broadcast those events to everyone, so you have to tell us if you want to be involved so that we can really make those meaningful conversations. And we're excited to create this program and watch its impact. The only other thing I'll mention is, in addition to that, we're going to ask you to take our next version of the economic impact study so that we have a baseline from a few years ago, and we're trying to collect more data. So I know taking surveys are hard. We try to keep it fairly light, but if you will provide us your information, then we can take that and publish it back to the community and see how we're progressing on the issues that really matter to us. So as a follow-up from this meeting, you will get that email, and we would appreciate your response so we can build that data. And thank you again. Thank you, Denise and Julie, for driving that.
Thanks.